And Roger earlier sort of wrongfully praised me, I think, for the work on the BMA's bullying and harassment project. It's actually a project that really came from our members. It's the result of a resolution that went to our annual conference, and in particular our SAS doctors, and Amit is chair of our SAS Doctors Committee, who put it firmly on our agenda. And we've had a cross-BMA working party leading this work from all branches of practice, reflected. Many of our employment advisors, our industrial relations officers have all inputted into it. So it's a real collective effort. The project has been running for 2 years now. It's intended to run into next year as well. But we've spent much of the first year really looking at the evidence, engaging with our members, listening to our members. And at this 2-year point, we have just published a report on what we've learned so far and what we think, reflecting what members have said to us, what our engagement with other organisations. We've put out what we think needs to change. But as I said, this work is ongoing and we really welcome people's feedback on what we've said. And we really hope to learn from others and continue to work with others on this. So when we started off on this journey 2 years ago, the first point that we looked at was, as many of you have already talked about, the NHS staff survey findings. There's lots of surveys of bullying and harassment within the NHS, but the staff survey, it has its faults, but it's probably one of the largest, most representative samples. So it's already been mentioned that around 1 in 4 staff within the NHS experience bullying, harassment or abuse from colleagues or managers. If you look by staff group, it's around 22% of hospital doctors and dentists say that they have, in the previous 12 months, experienced bullying, harassment or abuse from a colleague or manager. But what lies behind those numbers? At the BMA, in spring this year, we set up a secure online portal. We'd begun through the project, we've done workshops, spoken at meetings, we've heard lots of stories and experiences. But we hadn't actually documented any of them. We set up a secure online portal to try and gain further insight and really reflect on the kinds of stories and cases that were coming up. And we launched it in April off the back of a news article. I think it was off the back of the interview we did with Chris at the back there, that got very wide pickup from our members. And within the space of a couple of weeks, we had well over 100 people had submitted stories. What was interesting was reading the stories in their own words. I mean, we've also looked at the casework that the BMA does. And so we have, notes from some of our employment advisors, and we've looked at them. But it's quite different seeing people's own words expressing what happened to them. And these are some of them. It affected my family. I lost sleep. I lost confidence with my behaviour and my clinical decision-making. I struggled to function, felt physically sick, emotionally broken. I used to cry on the way to work. This GP trainee actually went on to say they sometimes prayed a truck would run them over on the way to work. It was that bad. Bullying and harassment occurs on a monthly basis where I work. It's so bad that I can't even begin to explain. I consider leaving medicine on a regular basis. This one from a consultant is interesting. Among senior doctors, the culture is still very much, you suck it up. I am middle-aged, white, highly successful, not someone who many would consider at risk, but I've suffered much distress. So in June this year, we carried out a large-scale survey of our members asking about everything from NHS structures, financing, to issues around culture. And rather than ask about how many people had experienced bullying and harassment, because that's covered in the staff survey, we asked whether or not members thought bullying and harassment was a problem within their main place of work. And 2 in 5 doctors told us that it sometimes or often was. When you excluded primary care from that, GPs from that, it's actually half of hospital doctors said they thought it was a problem. And this Traditionally, I think as has already been touched on today, the traditional approach to bullying and harassment in the workplace was to view it as a relationship problem between two individuals that then had to be sorted out if it got worse and a complaint was made through formal procedures, investigations and procedures. This really picks up on the wider impact it has upon people. And as Roger was saying this morning, and I know Chris will say later this afternoon, there's growing evidence of the impact that just witnessing these behaviours has upon people and their ability to function well at work. So as I said, we have just published our report, put it out there for people to consider and engage with us, give us further feedback on. I've got some copies today, but it's also available on our website. Through the engagement we've done with our members, there were three themes that really began to emerge. And having identified those three themes, we spent some time over the summer this year asking further questions on these areas and how we might address the problems that people were picking up on. And they are the need to end the silence around behaviour and bullying at work, encouraging people to speak up about it, improving the resolution of problems and particularly formal complaints when they do arise. And then finally, what's needed to create a more supportive and inclusive culture within the workplace. So what do we mean by ending the silence? Well, if people won't speak up about bullying, the problems, there's a lack of awareness about the issues. The issues don't get addressed. They become normalised. People then start to mirror those behaviours. And quite soon you have an endemic culture of bullying, harassment, or just accepted rudeness and incivility at work. These, again, taken from some of the stories that we had. The daily beratings increased in severity to the point where I'd break down and cry. He asked me 3 times, "Do you think I am bullying you?" I felt pressured. I said no. That really picks up on how difficult it is for the individuals who are targeted to say something about the behaviour. And having read lots of these stories, spoken to doctors and medical students who've experienced this, one of the things they often say is, particularly, some of the doctors and trainees, I've spoken to trainees who said they never thought it would happen to them. They felt really confident. They did really well through most of their training, and then they found themselves on one placement. And they previously thought they were high flyers, and bullying only ever happened to people who were, weak somehow or lacked self-confidence, or weren't up to, a career in medicine. And they said when it started to happen to them, they became very anxious. They started doubting everything they did. They started questioning themselves, feeling that they were somehow to blame. They started trying to second guess everything they did, amend their behaviour so that they weren't targeted anymore. And often they become withdrawn from colleagues as well, and more isolated, and start to lack peer support as well. So they withdraw into themselves. And I think there is growing awareness now of the psychological barriers there are to expecting people who are bullied to be the ones to speak up and report the behaviour. This other quote here is an example of someone who feels that she was completely let down by her colleagues as well. "I was told to F off in the presence of 2 senior registrars and 1 consultant. They all pretended it didn't happen. None of them stepped in to say this was inappropriate. The person never apologised." So what have we said we think needs to happen to ensure people speak up more about bullying and harassment when it occurs? Well, first of all, it's very important to talk more about behaviours, and it's fantastic to see the work that you've been doing with your Code of Conduct, your professional standards framework. Because we've heard as well, particularly from junior doctors or medical students who are going on placements, who they're not sure if they've never really been in many workplaces. They're at the start of their careers. They're not sure if what they're experiencing is bullying or harassment. It's something they should be concerned about. It's something they should say something about. So we need to talk more about behaviours. We need to understand more about when behaviour like managing performance might be tripping over into bullying, and that's an issue that has come up a lot, if you read some of the stories especially. When is giving feedback or managing performance actually tripping over into bullying behaviour? We also need to have designated people within workplaces, that people could go separate from HR, separate from the formal procedures. People who feel like they have bullying or harassment concerns, they can go and have a quiet word with, informally and in confidence. Now, I know organisations are developing respect at work champions, dignity at work champions that people can have that conversation with. We did an interview with the anti-bullying czar at Hull and East Yorkshire that's on our BMA website. And her reflections were from her time there, because she was also identified as someone that staff could go and speak to if they had concerns. And she was reflecting on how valuable staff seemed to find that, because she said, the formal approach is so terrifying. People are afraid anyway once they've been bullied. And then to be told, well, you've got to complain about it, you've got to put in a formal complaint. They're then very afraid about what that's going to entail, what process that's going to kick off. So having her, who staff could go and have a word with, they could reflect on whether or not they were, there were issues that should perhaps be escalated. They could find out from her what would happen if things were escalated, or they could just be reassured that someone was listening to them within the workplace. That role could also be played, and I know it is increasingly being played, by Freedom to Speak Up guardians in England. The data that has come out from the National Office of Freedom to Speak Up guardians recently shows that bullying and harassment concerns are actually one of the most common issues that are being raised with guardians. I think it's very closely tied into patient safety, but I think actually there are more cases that they're reporting where people are raising bullying and concerns with them than specific patient safety issues. But we've also found, in talking to our members and doctors, there's a real lack of awareness of Freedom to Speak Up guardians. Not only do that means people don't know who their guardians are, but sometimes I've spoken to groups of doctors who've just said, what's that? There's a real lack of awareness. Or I was speaking to a group of consultants yesterday who looked quizzical when I put Freedom to Speak Up guardians on my slide, because they said, well, they're not to do with bullying, they're to do with patient safety. So I think that a lot more needs to be done to raise awareness of the role that guardians can play and the support that they can give. There's also a lot more work that needs to be done in improving the reach of Freedom to Speak Up guardians. And it was interesting, again, from my perspective, looking at the National Guardian's data, that a very, very tiny proportion of the issues that they deal with come from doctors, only 5%, compared to a third from nursing staff. And only 6% of Freedom to Speak Up guardians actually come from the medical workforce. So that may be one of the reasons why, when over 10% of the NHS workforce are doctors. There's also, as the National Guardian Office's data shows, there's also a really significant underrepresentation of BME staff who are guardians. So we need to really ensure that the guardians who are being appointed, and I know increasingly they're developing networks of champions as well, so they have more reach, that there is diversity there and that they can reach and they are making connections with all groups of staff who could be affected. Organisations, Roger talked this morning as well about the importance of actively monitoring what's going on within the workplace, not doing the traditional approach of sitting back and waiting for formal complaints to come in and then just looking at formal complaints. Sometimes you hear people saying, well, we don't have, we've hardly had any bullying and harassment complaints. We don't have a problem here, which completely misses the point that if, in many organisations where bullying and harassment is rife, people are going to be most afraid of making formal complaints. People will say things in anonymous surveys that they will not say elsewhere. So it's very important to use anonymous surveys and to look at that survey data to look at other feedback data, to look at what's coming into Guardians, what people are saying in exit interviews, to share that regularly with the board and with groups of staff to try and gain insights on what might be going on behind that. I know lots of the anonymous surveys that are done ask the question, have you been bullied or harassed at work? Well, the national training survey that the GMC does says, have you been bullied, harassed or undermined? And it's a yes-no answer, and then maybe a follow-up question of how often. There's no definition, though, of what bullying or harassment is. And you're left with, I think, as an organisation, this headline, well, you know, a fifth of staff, a quarter of staff, but you may not really understand bullying can cover a wide range of behaviours. There's actually a negative acts questionnaire that we highlight as an example within our report that's internationally recognised. It's free to use as long as you're willing to share the data with others. And it asks not only have you been bullied or harassed, they don't provide a definition, so they allow people to self-identify. But then later on in the survey, they do define it, and then they also provide a long list of negative behaviours at work that people can tick, and then ask how often they've experienced them. And that gives you a lot more insight. And actually, Madeleine Carter and colleagues, academics in Northumbria, did use the negative acts questionnaire to cover a range of staff in NHS trusts. And this is what they found were the top 10 negative behaviours. And you actually see from this, you know, particularly number 2, being exposed to an unmanageable workload. That's not something that's really amenable to shifting by just adopting dignity at work policies and professional standards frameworks. There's other organisational issues that clearly need to be addressed there if these things are going to be brought down. So yes, really recommend using this to gain further insight if you're struggling to understand why bullying and harassment is still going on despite your best efforts. So just to go back as well, the final 2 things in this area of our recommendations is encouraging bystanders to be more active. Now, there's fantastic, about 3 or 4 years ago, I attended a presentation of someone who was adopting this Kiva programme that's been developed in Finnish schools to address bullying in Finnish schools, and they're implementing it in some Welsh schools now. And it has amazing evidence to show effect of being able to reduce bullying and harassment. And the primary focus of this programme is to target the bystanders and empower the bystanders to be able to say something. What it also importantly does is it gives the children, in this instance, the opportunity to practice how they might speak up and intervene on behalf of others. So they have like video games and things where it's designed to build empathy with people when they see that they might be suffering and practice saying something. Because it's all very well telling bystanders, telling people they should intervene, or telling, you know, people who may be affected by poor behaviour that they should challenge it. Often in the heat of the moment, or you may think you would, but then in the heat of the moment, you just don't know what to say or how to do it. And it's important to give people the chance to rehearse, or forms of words. There's one trust that has worked with staff, and they've adopted a See Something, Say Something campaign. And staff are encouraged to say, in the spirit of see something, say something, can I just say? A sort of quite calm, neutral approach to raising issues. But yes, we also, at our bullying and harassment, the BMA conference we had on the 1st of November, I think one of the sessions on the day that we had excellent feedback on and people found particularly useful was a performance theatre, a forum theatre piece, where we had actors playing out a series of scenarios, and then the audience were encouraged to intervene and to give advice. And I heard from academics afterwards that actually there is evidence that that kind of experiential learning really does affect how people behave and react, rather than the online learning modules or reading things or PowerPoint presentations. So the next area that we addressed because as soon as we started talking about the need to end the silence, to encourage people to speak up, we soon heard from doctors, our members, who had spoken up and had a very poor response. Or people who knew of stories of colleagues, they'd seen how colleagues had been treated when they did speak up. So we've said very strongly, we need action across all of these areas. You can't just encourage people to speak up if when they do speak up, their concerns are not taken seriously and responded to promptly and effectively. So again, from our stories, a trainee doctor, I was pinned to a wall by the throat by an emergency medicine consultant. When I reported this to my surgical consultant, I was told not to make trouble, it might affect my references. This one, this was a doctor who said, when you do complain, it's like management don't know what to do with it. And sometimes it can seem easier to cut the string by the thinnest part and blame the one raising the concerns. And we've heard quite a few stories like this. So when it comes to improving resolution of formal complaints within the NHS, obviously it's BMA, we represent doctors when they have bullying and harassment issues, when they get involved in formal procedures. We actually looked at our casework on bullying and harassment, and we surveyed our employment advisors who regularly support members. What was interesting from that was, and it's reflected in what Amanda and others have said, is that actually bullying and harassment is a small proportion of our casework. And I think that partly reflects as well, people don't often come to the BMA because they think, well, we'll go to the union once we're ready to formally complain. So we've also done work and produced videos, social media videos, to encourage people to come to us sooner, because our advisors are also telling us that by the time people come to us, they've got to the point, it's gone on for years, and they've got to the point where they have to make a formal complaint, but it's gone on so long, it's much harder to deal with. So it doesn't improve our success rates in dealing with them. But what was interesting is you look at our casework, there's a small proportion of our casework is bullying and harassment. But when you look at cases that are going on for more than 6 months, bullying and harassment is a really big part of that. And our advisors actually, have said typically these cases take 6 months to a year to resolve. I've heard stories where it's gone on for, I actually heard one of a doctor who was on suspension for 4 years. And that doesn't benefit anybody at all. It's hard on all parties, these procedures, formal procedures. But when you look at the policies, they weren't sort of necessarily saying that the policies had to change. They were just saying the way they're implemented, there are delays, there's lack of resourcing for investigations sometimes. And they're just, and sometimes, I did hear, I will reflect back what one has said as well, or a couple have said, that sometimes it feels like they're just dragging out the procedure in the hope that one party will leave. So there's a fear of actually getting on and dealing with the issues. We also heard from our advisors and our members quite often that they didn't think that alternative means of resolution were explored often enough. And mediation came up quite a few times. We have said, though, and I recognise that mediation is not always appropriate in dealing with particularly harassment cases, and particularly where there's a very wide power imbalance between the parties that you're dealing with. It's not appropriate to try and get them together in a room and make an agreement in a non-judgmental way. And it won't work either if one party completely lacks insight. So people need to know if mediation is going to be used, and there's a feeling from our members and our advisors it should be explored more often. People need to know what they're getting into, what to expect from mediation, and all parties need to be supported, and there needs to be mediators, trained independent mediators who are readily available. But what came across actually probably most strongly when we talked about this area was, and it ties in with the Just Culture stuff, I think, was the need to get in much, much sooner and nip problem behaviours in the bud. I think particularly those instances of bullying where people have thoughtlessly done or said things, or a conflict between individuals or within a team, communication has broken down, people need to get in much, much quicker and deal with low-level unprofessional behaviour before it really escalates into more serious patterns of bullying and harassment. And I've spoken to, through this project, I've spoken to lots of our members who have been accused of bullying and have been through these processes on the other side, some of whom have said, if only someone had said something sooner. If my behaviour was so bad, why didn't anybody say anything? So there needs to be much more encouragement to open up and deal with these issues. I'll just put up, we highlight this as an example of approaches within our report, and I think it's something that the GMC is about to begin doing work on in this country, whether it can be implemented in a UK setting. But Vanderbilt University's Centre for Patient and Professional Advocacy has this professionalism pyramid, which starts from the premise that the vast majority of doctors conduct themselves in exemplary ways, and occasionally, almost all of them will have a lapse in their conduct. Those lapses, those single unprofessional incidents, perhaps losing their temper, saying something they shouldn't, should be noted and dealt with through an informal, what they call an informal cup of coffee. But if there's a pattern of behaviour emerging, it also makes clear that there should then be escalated communication. And it should escalate to making them aware that how they're behaving is not appropriate, is not how most doctors, healthcare professionals are behaving. If the pattern continues, it then goes up to a guided intervention and agreement to change behaviour. And if that continues, it then goes up to disciplinary action. And the dotted lines as well also show that you don't have to rigidly follow this. There's an element of judgment here. And particularly the red and yellow triangles there show that there can be single incidents that are so bad, it is appropriate to immediately escalate. But the evidence on this shows that, tracking 67,000 physicians over 20 years, 37,000 of them, that's over half, had at least one patient complaint about behaviour. But only 3% went on to show a recurrent pattern, and only 267 went up to that level 2, and only 84 required a disciplinary intervention. So if this is consistently applied, then it can really get in sooner and reduce the need for that formal approach. And I would echo what others have said, and I've heard it many times from our advisors and some of our members. We have a quote from one of our members in our report as well, who said, by the time it gets to formal processes, you feel like you've lost, and the situation often can't be resolved. So the third area that came up often in our conversations with members was the need for culture change. That's very easy to say. It's said very often, but obviously it's much, much harder to do. I think sometimes the efforts to change culture that members have talked about their experiences within trusts or what their trusts are doing, it can feel like it's very focused. Changing culture is very focused on changing individual behaviour, putting up posters, leaflets, training, awareness raising, telling them how they should behave, or opening up discussions about how they should behave in the workplace. That is very important, but it's not sufficient. Because sometimes we've heard, particularly from our members working in pressurised environments with rota gaps, critical incidents, that they know how they should be behaving, but they're human. And sometimes they can't help but have those lapses in conduct. And the more pressure that you put on individuals, the more pressurised the environment that they're working in, the more likely that it is that they will struggle to contain their emotions at all times and to all times behave professionally. So there needs to be organisational action as well. So we asked our members in our member survey we did earlier this year, of those who thought bullying or harassment was a problem within their workplace, why do they think it was? And you see from this, 2/3 said it was because people are under pressure. The next most common response was that it was difficult to challenge as behaviour comes from the top. And we heard the phrase very often through this project in our conversations with doctors about bullying down the line, feeling like it comes from the very top, from politicians, from regulators, it's passed on to chief executives, to managers, and people are taking out the system pressures on people beneath them. Now, it's very important to say as well, and we've said it in all our communications with members, and we say it in the report, that being under pressure does not excuse bullying behaviour. Because if you're under pressure, your colleagues will be under pressure as well. And actually, healthcare, particularly in the NHS, you're working in a very stressful environment, a high-risk environment. In order to be able to function well in that environment, I know, Chris will speak very powerfully about this afternoon. In order to function well in that environment, you need supportive relationships. Being bullied by colleagues is only going to make things worse for you and make things worse for patients and patient care as well. Caroline Elton, who's written a fantastic book called Also Human, reflecting on her years as working as an occupational psychologist within the NHS and a counsellor to doctors, said that in her experience, what makes work rewarding for many physicians is the support of colleagues and the sense of belonging. And if you take that away, it makes things very, very hard for people to function and function to the best of their ability. But clearly what is needed to address bullying and harassment is some action to alleviate the system pressures. It's not all about changing how you all as individuals behave day to day within the workplace and telling you have to change behaviour. There has to be action to alleviate the system pressures. There also needs to be organisational action to make it easier for people to develop and maintain supportive working relationships. One of the things that we highlight, and we had a speaker at our conference at the 1st of November, is Schwartz rounds. I don't know if they happen here. Do they? Yes, good to hear. Have many of you attended them? Yeah? So through this work, I found out about them, and I spoke to Jocelyn Cornwell, who's the Chief Executive of the Point of Care Foundation. There's very strong evidence about the impact they have on individual staff well-being, but I was interested from the perspective of creating a space where you're not in a meeting to try and find a solution to anything, to diagnose anything. You're just there to actively listen to other colleagues' experiences. And I think that really helps people reflect on what it feels like to provide healthcare from different perspectives. The other things, the more simple things though that can be done, the BMA has put out a rest and facilities charter. There needs to be action to ensure that staff have opportunities to meet outside of immediate pressurised patient-facing environments, to interact with each other, to ensure that they're rested, that they have access to refreshments, so that those hungry, angry, late, tired moments when you're more likely to lose your temper don't happen. During the junior doctor contract dispute, with all of those big issues that we were dealing with then, there was a blog from a junior doctor about getting to work and there being a sign, written sign up, just saying, from now on, if you want tea bags, you've got to chip in for them. And that just had a flurry of responses. It's one of the biggest responses we've had of people, all doctors, sort of exchanging stories about what seemed like very minor things, but these minor sort of issues actually lead to this feeling that kindness at work doesn't matter, consideration for staff doesn't matter. And it really erodes employee morale and goodwill. And probably, people will think, well, what, you're telling me I have to behave like this, but what are you? You're showing no care for me and for staff. There also needs to be, there's a lot of talk now about the need for compassionate leadership or collective leadership within the NHS. Professor Michael West has led on this, a lot of this work, and he talks about, leaders who actively listen to staff, who actively try to create a psychologically safe environment. As I said before, healthcare is a risky and stressful profession, even if it were better resourced and staffed than it is within the NHS. And it's up to leaders really to create an environment where people can cope with that stress and that pressure, not leaders who add to it by bullying and blaming and singling out staff when things go wrong. We also have talked about the need to embed human factors in medical selection, education, training and work practices. It's apparent that, still within the medical profession and, our doctors involved in medical education and our medical students have said this to us. We're told it's about compassion, but actually the culture is very much, it's about academic excellence, clinical excellence. And as soon as they get to medical school, there's a very individually competitive environment, which then makes it difficult to really kind of develop those collaborative and the understanding of the impact of behaviour and the importance of behaviour on colleagues and on patient care. Another issue that we really feel needs addressing is the need to provide more training and support on giving and receiving effective feedback. It seems from the stories we've heard, all too often still, there is a perception that people learn best from being publicly humiliated or challenged in front of patients or peers. There's a lot of very strong examples among our collection of stories, particularly from trainees, about being publicly humiliated or sarcastic jokes made about them. And obviously that isn't managing performance, helping them to perform better. There's a surgical trainee wrote a very good piece for us for a BMJ online learning module we did, reflecting on the one placement where he was bullied. He was very high performing up to and after this one placement. But this one placement, he talked about how it eroded his confidence. He became full of self-doubt. His performance declined. That then led to greater criticism and greater anxiety, greater fear, loss of confidence, performance declined. And he was soon in a spiral where he went from a top-performing trainee to near the bottom, struggling to get through. So giving feedback in that way doesn't actually lead to better performance. And then the final two issues linked to equality, diversity and inclusion. I've separated out disabilities here and I've separated it out in the report. The NHS staff survey shows that actually the staff group by protected characteristics who are most likely to be bullied or harassed are disabled staff. What was interesting reading our collection of stories was how many, when I got through to like the second or third paragraph, they didn't say up front, I've got a disability or an ill health, a long-term health condition. But when you started reading it and the catalogue of events, quite often it was staff who had disabilities, were returning to work, having had a period off with ill health. And it seems to be an interaction of, unconscious bias or attitudes to people who are different, mixed with all of the pressures in the NHS system and a perception that if you're not really strong and superhuman, then the NHS can't carry you. There are people who said they came, I've heard quite a lot of stories of doctors who had a period of ill health and were returning to work. They were meant to be on a phased return. They were being pressurised by colleagues to work more hours, to do more out of hours, to make up for the time they had off. I've also worryingly heard quite a few incidents of people who said, well, yes, you can have your phased return, but you have to take your annual leave to get it. You have to use your annual leave to get the phased return. Doctors, there was a trainee who was disabled who needed adjustments to be able to perform better. She was open, she declared that she had this disability. Otherwise, she wouldn't have got the adjustments. But she said on every placement, she was very reflective, and she said, it just became apparent that, and I've heard this from other trainees actually, that the sort of competition, that once they're all aware of who might be struggling, then they often become this like relief, and they're the ones who become targeted and criticised the most. And she said, she went into every placement and it was like, declared her disability, people saw she needed adjustments, and it was like, oh, she's the weakest link here. That's fine. She's the one who's going to be targeted, we're all safe. So I think a lot more work needs to be done with around, for us, doctors and medical students with disabilities, but I imagine across the NHS on how disabled staff are treated. And it's great the Workforce Disability Equality Standard will be starting next year. But then, you know, finally, I won't keep you from lunch any longer, but the importance of valuing diversity is clear as well. I've mentioned disability as a particular case for bullying and harassment, but it's very clear from the statistics that BME doctors and the stories we've heard, BME doctors are far more likely to experience bullying and harassment than white staff. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans staff, it's the same. There's clearly, you know, the NHS workforce is incredibly diverse, but it does still seem that the attitudes or how that diversity is managed is way behind. We asked a very simple question in our member survey as well to our members of, do you believe that there is respect for diversity and a culture of inclusion within your workplace? 70% said yes. I still find that very worrying because it's like these are basic kind of attitudes you would think of human kindness and respect, and there's still like a third of our members think that's not the case. When you looked by ethnicity, just over half of BME doctors said they didn't think there was respect for diversity or a culture of inclusion. That's almost half of them feeling that they are lacking that basic need of a sense of belonging. And it was mirrored in the teamwork question as well. Do you think there's effective teamwork? Again, a really significant gap between white doctors and BME doctors. And what's interesting to know from the white doctor perspective, they think everything's fine. They don't see the issue as much as BME doctors. And that's, you know, very worrying consequences for teamwork and for patient care. So a lot more needs to be done, I think, still within the NHS on diversity and inclusion. I know everyone does training, but I think there does need to be a review. And I know Roger's done a lot of work on this about the effectiveness of some of the training that is being delivered, whether or not it really is leading to changes in attitudes and behaviours, and the ability of managers to manage and lead diverse teams. So that's it from me. Thank you.